Broken authentication is the second most common type of vulnerability that's found in applications right now, according to the OWASP top 10 list. It's a type of vulnerability that essentially revolves around the way that we authenticate users, whether it be through username and password or different methodologies like biometrics and secure tokens or that sort of idea. And it's essentially flaws in those systems that allow an attacker to be able to gain authentication without being an actual authorized user. So in this video, I'll go over a few different types of broken authentication type attacks and discuss a little bit about how these sort of attacks are mitigated. So again, we're looking at issues that are really dealing with being weak or improperly implemented authentication. And authentication is really one of the key aspects of most applications, which is why it's so frequently targeted. If you have weak authentication, people can gain access to your system, and through access to your system, they can do a lot of worse things based on that. So any breaks in authentication would be considered critical issues and things that would need to be fixed really relatively quickly. So the first type of attack that we'll talk about is credential stuffing attacks. The idea of these types of attacks is that when there's a data breach from some website of some sort, that information is typically leaked somewhere online. And a lot of the time people can get access to those databases to be able to get lists of usernames and passwords, for instance. With the username and password list, someone can go to different web pages and try that same username and password against that web page to determine if the authentication works there too. This would be the idea of a credential stuffing attack. We have a list of usernames and passwords, typically compromised credentials from breaches, and we use a bot to automate this process of attempting to log in with those credentials. This type of attack has around a 0.1% success rate, which sounds very low. However, it's very easy to automate, which means that it can easily be implemented, easily set up to attack a system, and it will have some amount of success that will probably be able to get you at least one set of credentials, which a lot of the time is all you really need. The next type of attack is relatively similar to that, and it's related to brute forcing passwords and as well the general idea of weak authentication with weak passwords. Brute forcing is slightly different from the idea of credential stuffing. With brute forcing, we're attempting different combinations of letters and numbers and symbols to try to guess easily guessable passwords. And essentially, the idea is that we want to throw as much computation power as we can towards brute forcing these passwords to attempt to compromise the user account to gain access to the system. Now, the ability to do this is actually fairly easy. If someone's using just letters and numbers, for instance, a 6-character password can be cracked in about 3 hours with like a standard laptop. So essentially, the longer and more complex the password is, the less probability there is of being able to brute force it. However, in general, brute force attack tends to be a very effective attack if someone doesn't limit login attempts, because odds are there's going to be at least one person on your system who is going to have a weak password if you aren't enforcing a proper password policy. And if that is the case, then they'll be able to crack it relatively easily utilizing brute force attacks. So the next thing we'll talk about is weak credential recovery. This is one that we see actually fairly frequently. If a user forgets their password, they need to be able to recover it. However, the person who implements this system also needs to be able to verify who is trying to recover the password, because if someone who isn't the right person comes in and recovers the password, then they will be able to get access to the account without actually having to know the password, right? They can just recover it and then change it. So there's a few different aspects to this one. Most commonly, things like recovery questions are the easiest way to have a weak credential recovery type of attack. If you ask someone recovery questions, it's typically very easy to find the answers to them. There have been famous attacks that have happened with celebrities where people go to like interviews or Q&As and they ask their recovery questions, and then they answer those questions on the webpage and compromise their account through that. So a lot of the times this information is easily gathered through social media. There's a lot of information out there now. So asking recovery questions is a very bad idea for recovering passwords. Typically, the way that we do this now would be using two-factor authentication, an alternative email that you can email the credentials to, or like a phone number that you can verify from. So we use something that we know is going to be in your possession, or we hope is going to be in your possession. And speaking of two-factor authentication, missing multi-factor authentication is now becoming a big issue with compromising authentication. So multi-factor authentication helps add another layer of security. If you try to log in with a password, then we can ask you for some form of two-factor authentication, say like a verification code from your phone or from another email, maybe a fingerprint or something like that. And the idea is that it makes it much harder for an attacker to be able to authenticate as a user using multiple factors. So ideally, we'd be utilizing something like a phone to be able to do this, because oftentimes the only person who has possession of your phone and phone number would be you. Now, there are ways to be able to attack this. You may have seen recently in the news, people have been calling into customer service desks, pretending to be somebody and stealing their SIM card and therefore their phone number, and then being able to compromise it from there. So there are weaknesses to that sort of idea. In addition, sometimes people accidentally just like authenticate thinking that they were authenticating at the same time. Timing can play a really big role in that as well. So there are some flaws with multi-factor authentication, but as a general sort of sweeping statement, it is typically better than just username and password. It makes brute forcing and credential stuffing much harder if you have that multi-factor authentication available. So another thing that we can talk about is things like session IDs. A session ID is typically a way of authenticating a user throughout their session with the web page. If a session ID is exposed through something like the URL, for instance, like if it's written into the actual URL itself, or if it's exposed in a cookie, or it's leaked in some other way, an attacker could potentially gain access to it and be able to authenticate as the user using that exposed session ID. So ideally, session IDs should be properly handled in a way that is server-side only. That way, it's very hard for an attacker to be able to gain access to session IDs or any sensitive information that can be used to verify a user's identity. So to summarize, we can talk about how we can prevent these authentication issues. The main way to do this primarily is going to be to implement some form of multi-factor authentication. This will significantly help your ability to have a secure system, and different levels of multi-factor authentication are adequate for different systems. Perhaps a password and a phone authentication is fine for some systems. Some systems might prefer like a biometric authentication with a password if it's more secure. So those would be really good setups to be able to help with authentication issues. Things like using a password policy to prevent weak logins, right? Someone puts in like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We shouldn't be accepting that as a password. So this would be a good way to prevent that. Not shipping with default credentials is another great way. If you set up, say, like some form of like CMS or something like that, and it has a default like admin login that's just like admin, right? That could be exploited very easily for someone to just try default credentials on a whole list of sites running that specific software. So you want to make sure that you don't have those default credentials in your applications. Another big one is going to be to limit failed login attempts. So brute forcing relies on the fact that you are able to attempt to log in more than like 5 times, for instance. So if we limit invalid login attempts to 5 attempts and then lock the account, we're going to be able to prevent those brute force type of attacks. Now, this also is going to cause some issues for the user, because if someone tries to brute force them, their account will be locked, and then they'll have to potentially like call in to ask for the account to be unlocked, or they might have to wait a certain amount of time for it to get unlocked. So these sort of things are valuable, but more valuable is having a really good password policy that keeps their login secure. Combining the two together is great, but just keep in mind that limiting numbers of login attempts can be detrimental to the user as well. The final thing as well, as we discussed, is keeping session IDs on the server side. That way we aren't able to leak it to the client, which makes it easier for us to be able to store session IDs without worrying about people getting access to them. So this gives you a good idea of the different types of authentication issues that might exist in a system. Utilizing this information, you should be able to take a look at a system and determine whether they have any sort of authentication issues, and be able to suggest ways to patch those problems to ensure that your authentication is as secure as possible.